system consists mainly of two parts. One of them is from where we perceive sound, and the other one is from where we perceive balance, called the vestibular apparatus, which we will be covering tomorrow. Now, you might be wondering, how do we perceive sound in our environment? As soon as an object is displaced in space or certain vibrations occur in the air, then the different molecules in the air start colliding with each other and they start releasing some form of energy. This form of energy is being perceived by what we call our ears, and different animals or different species in the animal kingdom, they have different modified tools for the perception of sound and the perception of... Could you please mute your microphone? Thank you. So different animals, they have different organs for the perception of sound, and for a very good reason. Now, for example, in the first page that you've seen, the elephant, it has these huge organs for the perception of sound due to the fact that they perceive sound at the infrared or sub-infrared level. So they have these modified organs to be able to perceive different sounds that are not perceptible by us, but they're absolutely important for their own survival. So each species or each animal, let's say, has their own modified tools for the perception of sound, and these have been modified through phylogenetic development based on their vitality and based on their survival. So when it comes to sound, we're talking about three main important elements. One is frequency, which we have low or high frequency sounds. The other one is amplitude, which deals with loudness. And the other one is duration, based on for how long are these waves of sound being released. Now, frequency is what we call high pitch or low pitch. And frequency, it is mainly what it is defined by the wavelengths that you see here. So a low frequency sound is going to have more dispersed curves, whereas a high frequency sound is going to have those type of curves closer to each other. And this is what we call low frequency and high frequency sounds. Now, based on the frequency and based on the interpretation of the sound that is in our outside environment, our ears are modified in such a level, particularly in the cochlea, to perceive a variety, a range, let's say, of sounds, a range of frequencies. And this, as we're going to see later in the coming slides, it is organized in a manner so that high frequency sounds are being perceived at the beginning of the cochlea, whereas low frequency sounds travel farther and to a greater extent across the vestibular ducts. So over here, we have the auditory system of what we call hearing. So the ear is being modified to perceive the sounds or the wavelengths of air in our environment. And as soon as they hit the tympanic membrane and as it vibrates, then we have the intensification of sound and the enhancement of sound. And this is being done by these small guys over here. So the malleus, incus, and stapes, as they vibrate, they amplify this sound and they're being perceived by the inner ear of what we call the cochlea. Now, the cochlea is organized in such a way to perceive, as we said, low frequency and high frequency sounds. Low frequency sounds travel furthest, whereas high frequency sounds, they are mainly governed at the beginning of the cochlea. Now, something quite important over here, we also have what we call the Eustachian tubes. These type of tubes, they are functioning more or less as the lymphatic system of the inner ear, and they clear the ear from any secretions, from any additional fluid secretions. In the occasion, however, that these tubes are being clogged, then we have a diminished perception of sound due to the fact that the tympanic membrane cannot vibrate to the extent that it would like to in order for it to be able to amplify the sound. Okay, so let's look at sound transduction into a little bit more detail. So as we said, sound waves produce mechanical vibration in the tympanic membrane or the eardrum, and eventually if we have a middle ear infection or a buildup of fluid in the middle ear due to a cold, then the vibration of the tympanic membrane cannot happen to the extent that we would like it to happen to perceive the pitch or the frequency to the extent that we would like it to do. This is why when we are cold, we feel like we're being underwater because of the buildup of fluid in the inner ear. In the inner ear, we have the three bones that amplify the sound in the inner canal. And if noise levels are high enough, then small muscles in the inner ear could pull apart these small bones so that sound is not perceived at such a high amplitude that could potentially damage the stereocilia of which are the ones that are responsible for the perception of sound. Let's say the small hair cells in the cochlear duct that are gonna transduce, or they're gonna enable us to perceive sound. So over here, we have a diagram or more or less of what's going on in the cochlea. Over here, we have high frequency sounds that are being perceived at the beginning of the cochlear duct. And as we go along through the cochlea, we see that frequency is much lower. Through the vestibulocochlear nerve, these are being translated in your auditory cortex based on where the sound has been perceived. So these stereocilia that are moving based on where the frequency of the sound is perceived, they're sending specific messages in regards to the frequency of the sound. So in broad terms, what happens? We have sound waves that strike the tympanic membrane. We have the amplification of sound by the small bones in the inner ear. And as soon as Steph moves, these vibrations are being translated by the oval window into specific fluid oscillations. And these fluid oscillations are going to displace the vestibular duct along with the cochlear duct, and they're going to give us different types of frequencies. So based on where this is being perceived, we have the adjacent energy signals that are being taken up by the vestibulocochlear nerve. Something quite important is that the vestibular duct as well as the tympanic duct, they are being bathed in what we call the perilymph. Now, the perilymph has high concentrations of sodium compared to potassium, something that is being reversed in the cochlear duct, where we have the organ of Corti that gives us what we call the perception of sound. This endolymph is being released by the epithelial cells, and as it is being released, it enables sound, let's say, to travel to longer distances, and for a good reasons, because sound, when it is underwater or in occasions that they're wet, it travels much further and faster compared to just thin air. Now, the cochlear duct, which gives us, as we said, the sound, contains the basilar membrane and the organ of Corti, as well as the tectorial membrane, which we're going to see later on. These is the important part of the auditory system, because it contains the organ of Corti that has the hair cells or the stereocilia that bend when we perceive sound. So these are some essential differences, as we've covered before, between the vestibular duct, tympanic duct, you can see in the same shape over here is in blue. So the vestibular ducts and tympanic ducts are continuous to each other, and they communicate through this portal over here that we call helicotrema. Now, as sound travels and fluid is being displaced, then you can imagine that it is displaced across these two membranes. But meanwhile, when it does that, we have the displacement of also the organ of Corti. So based on where the sound is perceived, that sound is basically also gonna tell us that until here, I will be able to perceive a specific frequency of sound. But if it travels all the way up to the end, then we're talking that we're perceiving low frequency sounds. So one main difference between the cochlear duct and the vestibular and tympanic ducts is that the vestibular duct and tympanic ducts are connected to each other through what we call helicotrema. Although the cochlear duct is a dead end, the only other organ with which it communicates with is the vestibular apparatus that gives us balance, which we're going to see later on. Thus, the accumulation of excessive endolymph in the cochlear duct is also going to create not only a ringing sound, what we call tinnitus, but it could potentially also inflict the vestibular apparatus to such an extent that it could potentially displace the otoliths that gives us the perception of balance and could create a sense of vertigo. One second essential difference between these two tympanic cochlear systems is the fact that although the vestibular and tympanic ducts have the perilymph, which has a high concentration of sodium, the endolymph in the cochlear duct has higher concentration of potassium and lower concentrations of sodium. Thus, as you can imagine, the organ of Corti or the stereocilia, in order for them to be activated, they need to allow themselves for more potassium to enter the cell membrane compared to the function of the vestibular and tympanic ducts. Now, the cochlear duct contains, as we said, the organ of Corti, and on the organ of Corti sits the basilar membrane that contains the stereocilia or kinocilia. Now, these kinocilia are the ones that are going to tell us if, when they move, and from where they move across the organ of Corti, they're going to tell us if we have a high frequency or a low frequency sound. Now, the tectorial membrane is adjacent on the organ of Corti, and as the fluid moves around the vestibular ducts, it displaces the fluid, and also it displaces the tectorial membrane. So as you will see on the next slide, as the tectorial membrane moves, because as we said, the vestibular, the basilar membrane is completely, let's say, it works as an individual body compared to the cochlear duct, then it will displace the stereocilia, and as they move, these are going to give us the different perceptions of different frequencies. Now, as soon as sound is being perceived across the cochlear duct, we have the projection of these signals to the auditory system. And these systems, they mainly synapse, they pass through the thalamus compared to what we said in the olfactory system, but they also project to the medulla. So the left and right cochlea, they're first going to reach the medulla, and based from where the sound is coming from, based on, let's say, if it's perceived by the left or the right ear, then the projections to the medulla is going to enable the individual to turn their head left or right, more like a reflex effect. As they leave from the medulla, they go through the cerebellum, which there are some minor projections that have to do with balance, and through the cerebellum, we have them reaching the left auditory cortex and the right auditory cortex. Now, hearing loss could happen in a variety of ways. From the very simple terms, we have conductive hearing loss, in which the ear canal could be clogged due to earwax. We could have the buildup of fluid in the middle ear. This could be due to an infection. It could be also, and when we call infection, it does not necessarily mean that it comes from the esophagus, but it could also come from, let's say, the tympanic membrane if it's inflamed for some reason. Disease or trauma could also disrupt the vibration of the malleus, incus, and stapes, and this could lead, we wouldn't say incomplete hearing loss, but it would definitely dampen the ability of the other individual to perceive hearing. Now, central, it is definitely quite more complex, and in fact, there is no real way of fixing it. So if we have central hearing loss, we're talking about the auditory cortex being completely gone. And if that's the case, then the individual cannot perceive sound unilaterally. When we're talking sensory neural, and in these occasions, things become a little bit more complicated, it will happen as a result of the death of the inner hair cells due to loud noise, and this is common among youth, especially the ones that are attending to regularly to rock concerts. On the other hand, we could also have the normal hearing loss, such as in elderly, called presbycusis, and this is potentially a natural loss of hair cells, because as any other part of the body, hair cells could potentially die, and they're being replaced by naturally ingrown stem cells in the cochlear system. Now, one way of fixing this is for cochlear implants to be attached to the cochlear to the basilar membrane that they're gonna transduce, and they are gonna enhance the perception of sound. Although death of inner hair cells could only potentially be alleviated by the implantation of new stem cells. Cochlear implants do not necessarily fix deafness or hearing loss. So this has been our lecture today. It has been very brief, but to the point. And now I'm gonna open the room for discussion if you have any further clarification. Doctor, I don't understand how hair cells will be activated differently to the different sound levels. Okay. So let's look into one of these slides. So as you will see here, the different hair cells are deposited across the cochlear duct. So high frequency sounds remain close to the base and to the oval window, okay, where the stapes moves. They cannot travel further back, but low frequency sounds, because of the less violent displacement of the perilymph and the endolymph, they can travel all the way back. Because remember that high frequency sounds, they have these curves, as you've seen, that they're closer to each other. Eventually, these curves that you have will also displace the water much more abruptly. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it will reach all the way up to the end, because the water, when it's being displaced, and this is the laws of physics, if you have a big power that is going to displace water, then the water also works as a barrier. It does not allow the displacement of molecules further down the line. Hair cells are being replaced by stem cells that are naturally ingrown in the cochlear duct. Although as we age and as any other part of the neuronal system, they're not being replaced at the same level as they used to. Central or unilateral hearing loss. When we talk about central hearing loss, we're talking about the auditory system altogether, whether it's on the right or whether it's on the left. But it is very rarely that we're going to have a bilateral stroke on both of the auditory systems. This is why I've mentioned unilateral. Now, the ion composition. So in the endolymph, we do have what we said, higher levels in the endolymph, not the perilymph. Let me go to a slide which is going to make a little bit more sense for you guys to follow. So in the vestibular duct and the tympanic duct, we have the perilymph. And the perilymph is like any other part of the cortex or any other part of the human system. It has higher levels of sodium and lower levels of potassium. Now, in contrary to the cochlear duct, it has higher levels of potassium compared to sodium. So if the stereocilia that are going to give us auditory transduction, in order for them to be activated, they work with potassium. They don't work with sodium, such as any other system. So for them to be activated, for them to open up, let's say, their ion channels, they need to allow more potassium to flow in for nerve conduction to occur. Yes. Hair cells are usually replaced by stem cells. Okay, guys, this brings us to the end of today's sessions. If you don't have any other questions. So, yeah, both of them, they do receive projections from both ears, both the right and the left auditory system. However, it's as we're going to see in the visual system, there is also a cross-link. So let's say the right ear is going to project to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is going to project mainly to the right hemisphere. Yes, so if there's a problem with the hair cells, we can only help by implanting stem cells, and this is currently experimental. It has not been proven. Sound can cause vertigo if it's very, very high sound. Yes, the cochlear duct communicates also with the sacula. I don't know how to answer your questions. If the cochlear duct's higher voltage threshold than the vestibular tympanic ducts. Guys, if you have any further questions, please feel free to email me. So as you can understand, everything is written down in your slides. Please pay attention to at least one of the slides that says to you, look at the notes. try and remember this slide that I have over here in front of me, so that you understand the differences between the different ducts. And also, the main idea of basically the auditory system is for you to understand where do we have hearing loss, and also where do we have low or high frequency sounds being perceived. Those are the main important points of your today's session. Thank you all very much for attending, and see you all tomorrow.